Rolling on. In part three, we've got a couple, literally two letters from Oliver Cowdery. That, again, won't get too hot and heavy into, but some interesting things. This is coming, again, chronologically, before section 49. So I'm kind of going a little bit in reverse order, but I thought it might, with everything that we've already talked about, color and give some light to what was going on at the time. So some papers introduction into these letters. These actually predate sections 49 and 50, as I said before, in the chronology of the Joseph Smith papers. Mostly missionary reporting from this group missionary effort that was going on. So this is Parley P. Pratt, this is Oliver Cowdery, and others. It is contained in a book called Letter Book 1. So the handwriting here is actually Frederick G. Williams. The first letter to Joseph Smith was written in 8th of April, 1831, and the second letter that we get is from 7th of May, 1831, so about a month later. So a little bit of the contents and footnotes from these letters that we get. So what we get here from the historical introduction here, since Cowdery's letter of the 29th of January, the missionaries had encountered difficulties with government officials in their attempts to preach to the American Indians. Federal Indian agent Richard W. Cummins sent a letter on the 15th February to his superior, General William Clark, who was serving as superintendent of Indian affairs in St. Louis, alerting him to the presence of the Mormon missionaries. Cummins told Clark that the men, quote, act very strange and claim, quote, they are sent by God and must preach. Cummins explained further, quote, they have a new revelation with them as their guide in teaching the Indians, which they say was shown to one of their sects in a miraculous way, and that an angel from heaven appeared to one of their men and two others of their sect. I have refused to let them stay or go among the Indians unless they first obtain permission from you or some of the officers of the general government. Unquote. Cummins threatened the missionaries with imprisonment if they continued their preaching, according to Peter Whitmer Jr., a member of the missionary party. In his summary of the confrontation with the Indian agent, Whitmer wrote that after the missionaries had commenced their preaching to the Delawares and the tribe of Shawnees, to our sorrow there came a man whose name was Cummins and told us that he was a man under authority, and he told us that he would apprehend us up to the garrison. So this was not well received by somebody that was not in this Native American tribe. So what to do? Well, we get this. In an effort to obtain a permit to preach to the Indians, Cowdery wrote to Clark on 14 February 1831, a letter that Parley P. Pratt presumably took to deliver in person on a journey to the east, which included a stop in St. Louis. However, Clark was absent from his St. Louis post at the time Pratt arrived, and there is no indication that Clark responded to Cowdery's letter. Nevertheless, Cowdery's 8th April letter suggests that the missionaries expected a favorable resolution to their conflict with Cummins, through Pratt's efforts to obtain a permit from Clark. So apparently he had to have a permit to go to these lands. And I don't know back then if they called them reservations or not, but there were these United States agents that were over that whole thing, and you needed a permit and so forth. So getting into our second letter, a lot of that's from the first letter. Into the second letter a little bit more here from the historical introduction. And this, of course, all of this is in Documents, Volume 1 of the Joseph Smith Papers. Says, in the 7 May 1831 letter featured here, Cowdery expresses an expectation that Pratt, who had already been traveling for nearly 3 months, would soon return. Delays in communication between Ohio and Missouri meant that Cowdery had no more knowledge of Pratt's activities in May than he had when he wrote to the Ohio church leaders a month earlier, on the 8th of April. The most recent letter to Cowdery from church leaders in Ohio evidently gave no news of Pratt, so it was almost certainly written before Pratt's arrival in Kirtland. Cowdery had received a letter from Pratt while Pratt was in St. Louis on his way to Ohio, and then he wrote this 7th of May letter. He apparently assumed that Pratt had already arrived in Kirtland. Pratt had in fact been delayed on his way to Kirtland by bad weather and a severe bout with the measles, and it is unlikely he reached Kirtland before late March. In any case, he had arrived at least by the first week of May, on the same day that Cowdery penned the letter featured here, 7th of May. Joseph Smith dictated a revelation instructing Pratt to preach to the Shaker settlement north of Kirtland, which delayed Pratt's return to Missouri. While that assignment ultimately lasted only 2 days, he did not return to Missouri until September. So that Pratt visit to the Shaker Society, again, wound up him doing a little dust shaking, and it didn't go well for Pratt on that one. He was a little upset, apparently, by how he was received. So there you go. So what's the aftermath of these letters? Well, we get this again from the historical introduction. Though Cowdery's earlier letter indicated that the Missouri missionaries hoped Pratt would return with permission from Superintendent William Clark to preach in Indian Territory, the missionaries apparently never received such a permit, and they did not continue the mission. They did, however, remain in Missouri and were on hand when Joseph Smith and other church leaders arrived during summer of 1831, in accordance with the 6th of June revelation. Footnote 3 from this says, Cowdery and Ziba Peterson apparently baptized a dozen or so persons in Lafayette and Jackson counties in the months that followed, including Rebecca Hopper, whom Peterson married on August 11, 1833. Ziba, lock your heart, elder. Those of you who know, lock your heart, bro. Yeah. So that was a successful mission for Ziba Peterson on a couple of different levels. Footnote 8 from this as well says a little bit about Independence, Missouri, which I thought was kind of interesting. I didn't know this. It says, after its founding in 1827, Independence quickly became the eastern terminus for the Santa Fe Trail and the starting point for many Western travelers. So Cowdery may have had ready access to such information about the Navajo people from local travelers. I didn't know, like, Independence was a major gateway into the West on this trail that people were taking. And it's kind of interesting back in early American history where some of these frontier areas were kind of the shores of the sea, right? People would go there, they would sort of settle down and do whatever before they would launch off onto these trails, which to them was a whole lot like traveling the ocean. If you look at like how much space there is between, just as an example, Independence, Missouri, and someplace like Utah, there's a long way to go. So I just thought that was an interesting thing about Independence, Missouri, which is a town that still stands today. And that is what we have for you. So sections 49 and 50 and 2 letters from Oliver Cowdery, a little bit about Native America relationships with the United States government, how the missions were going, spiritual communication, what does that mean, questions that were asked, a lot of really interesting things that came from this that, again, the focus back then is very different than the focus now, in my opinion, but good to know what they might have been there. So again, thank you so much for joining, and we will see you next week with even more filling of even more history here on Filling in the History. Have a good one.